The handle turned in the empty kitchen and Cecilia Lupin stepped onto the orange and brown oversized flower tiles. Exhaling deeply, she stopped to look around at the room as the realization that her journey had now ended washed over her. She was back. Or rather, she was here. She had lived in this cottage once, at one time. Not in this time, of course. Here the cottage was inherited by the elder Lupin's son, by the son who was bitten by the werewolf, something which, of course, had happened in Old Place. But in the Old Place the elder son was the only son, Remus Lupin, and it had been here he had sheltered from the world to hide his lycanthropy, and here where Cecilia had lived, for a time, working on the Universal Link and Harry's potion before Severus Snape had whisked her away just before the Ministry had arrived to befuddle her. The knowledge that it was the first time she had been back here, even during her life with Remus in this world, struck her as important. Taking a few steps towards the former utility laundry room, Cecilia's mind returned to the time when it had been filled with 2 Liebig condensers, flasks, blends, vials. Now it was truly honoring its name with the old-fashioned slotted vent slats horizontal to let in the maximum heat from outside as shirts and trousers dried on an overhead hanging rail, and an ancient washing machine from a company Cecilia knew had gone out of business in the 1960s settled like an elderly relative in a comfortable armchair behind the door. The cottage, where she and Remus had spent their pre-wedding honeymoon period. The place which was almost totally isolated from the world, hidden from view from any road and a mile's walk from the main track. A place where a round shopping trip was 10 miles each way, and where only the most determined hiker might glimpse the green slate roof, to them a deserted crofter's cottage courtesy of the dissembled spell. She turned on her heel as a creak above her reminded Mrs. Lupin that her son was whom she was seeking, and she strode past the kitchen table and through the door into the living room, the furniture the same, and in the same orientation, as in Remus's cottage. She stopped. The view she had before her now was identical to one which she had had in her head when she had been unknowingly sheltered at the Dursleys, in the guise of a home tutor for Dudley. All those nights when she had cried herself to sleep in the Dursleys' spare room, she had pictured herself here, when she had heard the handle of the door pressed down and knowing it was Vernon Dursley attempting to try his luck, and hearing him curse under his breath at his inability to remove the chair from under it. She had screwed up her eyes and made her way in her mind up the open wooden stairs which were now to her right. When she had had to endure Petunia's dogged loyalty to her swine of a husband, she focused on Remus's soft features smiling at her from the dated, threadbare settee. When Dudley had belittled her and talked down to her when she had been teaching him, she remembered him holding her hand and talking about their future. And, as Draco Malfoy had identified her to the Ministry wizards and she had been pursued by a Dementor, this place was in her head. How it smelt, the food cooking in the kitchen, the acrid smell of a green Harry's potion base wafting in from the utility room which had formerly been a coal house, the living room, where she was standing now, where the open stairs led up to the bedrooms and small bathrooms before unconsciousness triumphed. Here, the house seemed the same structure, same open windows and rickety steps down from the kitchen to the moorland, which she had ascended. No, Cecilia remembered. This wasn't the first time she had been here. She had been here once before, when Septimus had been a few weeks old, and the Machiavellian mask of cunning that Cecilia was used to seeing in the years that followed and that she had come to abhor had slipped away to reveal genuine joy in their son, his nephew, and in the couple of days she and Remus had spent there Cleus had barely let Septimus out of his sight. Cecilia smiled as she recalled Cleus cooing over Septimus's Moses basket, oblivious to being seen. That's where he would be now, Cecilia assumed, in the same room that Cleus had provided for him all those years ago. Sentiment, it seemed, and familial love far stronger than double-facedness. But in essence the place was the same, with sepia pictures of Remus's parents on the steps down to the moorlands, bucket in hand to collect water and shovel in another to collect peat to dry and burn in the open fire. Even wizards liked to fit in with the local populace, and such activity was commonplace with Lakelanders. That wood was identified as being fuel, rather than by species, where limestone was dug up and heated to produce lime before being sprinkled by hand on the acidic soil, where the whole cycle of life, birth, death occurred not in sporadic isolation but as part of the fabric of the landscape. Where things were bought for function and only when they could not be made, adapted or altered for purpose. Not that Remus's parents were poor by any means, it was more their way of life, passed on from John Lupin's own parents. And to Cecilia, living there for just a short time, it felt more real, living with the land, not just in a house on it sealed off from it by double glazing. As she ascended the stairs she glimpsed her reflection in the mirror, shocked by her appearance. She looked far older than her 42 years. It was no wonder she had had several cars stop for her on the small stretch of the A591 that she had had to use to get across to Rydal. She looked like an old woman. And smelt like one too. For the first time in 200 miles she hoped Septimus wasn't here so she could at least get clean enough to see him. "Hello." Cecilia's voice croaked as it echoed upstairs. "Anyone home?" No answer. Descending back down the stairs she made the bold but critical decision to throw some logs on the fire, waiting a quarter of an hour for it to build up before taking off everything she was wearing and letting it burn, including her shoes. 10 days of hardship and sleeping outdoors, the staleness and dirt being turned into fuel for the back burner which Cecilia switched on. 10 minutes later and the water would be warm enough for a soak, a good trade. As she reclined in the soothing hot water her mind turned to the near future, when someone would be there, and how she explained her presence. No, Cecilia corrected herself, put her case firmly and assertively. It was only right that she, Remus and Septimus should be together as a family, return to Edgeford with the lakes behind them, and continue their lives. Then a thought occurred to her. She had brought nothing with her, other than what she was standing up in. On the bathroom chair in her shoulder bag lay some scribbled notes for belated goings on her journey. What would she do for clothing? Cecilia dried herself on the fresh clean towel that she had found in the airing cupboard, wrapping it around her before padding around to her son's room. Septimus had regularly spent time here in the summer. A great holiday for him when he was younger, and he always took with him some clothes for his parents in case they were ever to visit. Remus had come but she had never visited Septimus here in summers past. Her only hope after her stupidity was that he had kept the suitcase in his room. On top of the wardrobe she found what she was looking for, and Cecilia pulled out a patterned top and a long skirt, something which clearly Septimus had thought were suitable clothes. What she must have been thinking when she bought such drab things Cecilia hadn't a clue, and were entirely hideous. Beggars can't be choosers, Cecilia thought to herself as she pulled on the clothes and then sat down on her son's bed. She looked around. It was a typical 11-year-old's room. Clothes that needed washing in a little pile behind the door next to some books. Others sat on the 1960s teak bookcase with models of Vikings and a longboat on the top. Amongst the books were ones about wizards, books about outdoors and some adventure books. A book which she and Remus had bought for Septimus about sea stories one Christmas was half under his bed. Near the window was a cage, a tiny owl huffing almost silently at the bottom of it, its eyes clamped shut and one wing over its head. Apart from the eyes Cecilia could almost have mistaken it for a tawny feathered tennis ball. How she wished she had been with Remus and Septimus to choose the little thing, and her heart warmed as she thought of them both in diagonally looking at pets. It cooled slightly as the decision about secondary schools had clearly been discussed in her absence, and, considering the magical creature and the existence of more than one book about magic in her son's summer holiday room, had the decision already been made? She looked around further, knowing that she couldn't be sure until she had seen Remus and talked to him or Septimus. But a part of her, the new her, had come to realize that she didn't care anymore. No matter where her son got his education, as long as she was part of his life, again questioned whether it mattered, in the long run. Shoes were scattered near the end of the bed, and Cecilia smoothed the candlewick bedspread which, underneath, gave way to a more modern duvet which she discovered when she remade the bed, finding a small magnifying glass which seemed to go with a mystery book between the pillows. As she did her mumsy tidying, it struck Cecilia that she had missed out on so much for the last nearly 2 years, and she didn't know her son as well as she should. Getting to her feet, Cecilia saw he had something else that was hers. On top of another heap of books by his wardrobe she saw a framed photograph, the last one of them, of the 3 of them, together, smiling, with Edgeford Forest behind them, a place where they used to take so many lovely walks as a family. "One of the only times which you ever made time for us," Remus had thrown at her, a sharp barb which struck deep and which had been one of the first thing he had apologized to her for when he had come to her at Durmstrang on the first day of June. Cecilia put the photograph aside and picked up a book next to which the photograph had been resting. It was a magic book, Book 1 of Spells, and she flicked through it, the description of the universal connection explained briefly, matter-of-factly, in neat Gothic script. Here the universal link had been discovered and developed by Severus Snape as Hedgewood's first academic research. Perhaps if other academic institutions, non-wizard universities and the like, whose doctors and professors were obliged to carry out research, had not questioned the honorary title of professor in magical academic establishments and called for parity, Snape may not have been the discoverer in this world. Cecilia debated this for the moment before dismissing the thought. It was not an exaggeration, she concluded, to consider the wizard a genius. Of course he would have discovered the universal link, if not he, who else? Which is why it felt so strange to think that something she had worked on in this very place was reduced to sentences that included a mention that energy was in cells of wizards which was channeled for them to use magic, whereas non-wizards didn't have that capability genetically. The W-band convention which she had originally devised, was explained in a fact box, and an interesting fact that wizards must be in magical environment for a long time for it to work to the best advantage. Which explained Petunia Dursley, of course, Cecilia thought, who, in the other place, had chosen not to develop her magical powers even though she probably had the same potential as her sister Lily. Then there was the people like Tunks's father who were carriers of the W-band but didn't have the ability to access it, but magical environments affected him, as they had done her as a non-wizard. Petunia Dursley. Here she was Petunia Black, a good friend and confidant of Cecilia, especially just after her bilious outpouring at Grimmauld Place and before she had been banished to Durmstrang. At Privet Drive, bitterness and sadness from all those years of being pushed aside, being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person, the wrong wizard, the wrong husband. Here, she was happy with Sirius's brother Regulus, and her son Daron was a well-rounded, down-to-earth child. Petunia was so very giving of her time, sitting up with Cecilia when she had hammered on her door in the early hours of the morning, having walked out of Grimmauld Place that night in a white-hot fury. In fact, Petunia was always the when she needed a chat. She understood the wizard world though chose not to be involved in it, and Cecilia had done, especially in the later years when she had deliberately distanced herself from the reciprocators. "Put it down," a voice in Cecilia's head told her as the old dragon of acrimony stirred. It was behind her. She wasn't going to trouble herself with magic and science anymore. Leave it to Severus. Leave it to the researchers at Durmstrang. Leave it to the reciprocators, if any of them ever appreciated the connection, of course. She reached for her leather shoulder bag, past the notes scribbled on the backs of receipts and adverts. Cecilia's hand rested on a slim copy of a book she shouldn't have. It was the last thing she would do. Her intention had been to pass it on to Cleus, and this is what she would do once she was reacquainted to her brother-in-law again. No matter what he had done to her, it was the right thing to do, especially considering the current mood, in the newspapers at least, from what she could gather. Deep down she felt that he was doing the best for what he saw was important. The Art of the Wise had taken her many weeks to copy down and, in its raw, Norwegian form, She hoped that she had copied it truthfully. For she knew that what was in it was important, for the greater good of all. She certainly hadn't done it for the reciprocators. No. She wouldn't think about the hostility that she could feel if Cecilia only let herself, save to remind herself that it wasn't them that she did this for. Not that she had read it, she had skimmed what she thought was a general lesson preparation notebook, but the words universal link had been repeated too many times in the small document to be a coincidence. She gazed at her notebook and smoothed the creased, card surface. To the wizards at Durmstrang their research was just a job, a means to make money. Few if any researcher teachers had a passion for science, for magic, for helping people just for the sake of it, for the love of it, although there had been one exception, Ragnhild Anderson, who would at least speak to her and ask Cecilia how she was. Her research was into the magical traits of the red-headed gene, and Cecilia often thought how useful to her a visit to the Weasley family would be. At first she had assumed it was her, the situation, that she was seeing her non-elected position in the ranks of the Durmstrang wizards from a jaded perspective, but Cecilia had learned that such a cool approach was common to all of the Durmstrang wizards. Not that she could approach work in that way, but Cecilia could see the advantages of keeping one step away from the subject matter of your work. She sat down on Septimus's bed again and stowed away the notebook. Her stay abroad had made Cecilia see the role of the reciprocators differently. Not that a part of her would ever forget how they had treated her. Forgive, yes, she would forgive for the sake of living back with her family, and their dedication, however false she felt it was in some of the witches and wizards, had made them an essential in the fabric and richness of the country's understanding between wizards and non-wizards. It wasn't as if the absence of Voldemort as he had been meant they were not needed, far from it. People needed reminding of the fact that differences didn't divide them but unite them. Those people, Lily, James, Henrietta. Sirius, the Weasley family. Severus. Remus. Those people who she thought she knew she had long ago realized that she certainly did not. That has been her biggest mistake. The huge assumption that she knew them, and on that basis been like she had been, making furthermore mistakes, assumptions, misjudgments, ill-judged remarks, out of context and, because only Aberforth, and then Severus and Cleus had known of her origin, could not make allowances for her. And further, she had not made the allowances she could have for their ignorance. Many had not said anything the night of, for want of a better word, her breakdown. Many had said nothing, which she had taken as being their silent agreement of Henrietta Edwards' diatribe. They had just lost their leader, for heaven's sake, and there she was, the non-wizard wife of one of them, yelling and screaming at her adopted daughter in front of them. Getting to her feet, Cecilia walked out of Septimus's room and downstairs as Cecilia, not for the first time, considered the whole sorry episode from a neutral perspective. Perhaps she was judging them too harshly. Would she have been sympathetic in her position? And had she been judging herself with equal severity? Would have been able to do what she had been doing for the last decade, considering what he had been through in the other place, knowing she couldn't go back and had to remain, and not have had some sort of breakdown? How much had she hated the apathy? This was the last she would think about it, but she had to get it out of her system once and for all. She had sworn to give her and Remus a chance and put Theseus, her feelings, into their grave. She shook her head, knowing she would never have been in 100-mile radius of people with their attitude if she had had a choice. She descended the stairs, looking at Remus's parents holding their peach shovels and buckets. They looked so happy. Remus had often told her that all the time he had known them, before both of them had died, they would treat one another as if a courting couple, holding hands, kissing, sharing private chuckles over silly things. Perhaps she and Remus could be like that now they had given one another a second chance. The August sun had waned a little and longer shards of sunlight were glancing through the western-facing picture windows, and Cecilia shook her head as she looked at the patterns the sunlight had created through the frosted living room door glass as it shone through and onto the mirror above the fireplace as she sat down on the larger of the tapestry-patterned, wooden-armed settees. Their indifference, the arrogance of such people in golden positions, such gifts that they just took for granted. And more than this, mocking her for her keenness, making allowances for Severus because of his unparalleled genius and position given identical circumstances. Was it Cecilia in herself that they despised so much, rather than her status? It was the women who thought like this. The wizards remained stony silent to the witch's incessant pallid chatter about personal advancement, status, possessions and female one-upmanship. How much she hated this, enhanced as it was in this backdrop. Behind their backs she called the women of the reciprocators the plastics for their brittleness, their fakeness, their artificialness, all of which was just so inherently irritating. It had been her defense. On the regular occasions she would have to stay with them and be sociable. Cecilia would cheer herself up by even numbering the witches, telling herself that them and their opinions were plastic personified, cheap but diverse and useful to have around. Thinking about it, was it really a defense, or was she really no better than them? No, she thought. One of them needn't have taken the barbs and indirect comments so far. It was never by accident that Henrietta criticized her Harry Potter book, or her mere honorary role in the reciprocators, or that she had been moved on from Hedgewards. All Cecilia knew was that there had been passion once in the reciprocators. Her favorite time before a meeting was to get there half an hour before any of the women showed up from work. Then Daedalus, Aberforth and Unctious Walker would talk about the old days, laugh about shared experiences, where they really connected with one another, where the quest for wizard-non-wizard understanding was personal and frontline, not like now, when those involved in the reciprocators had little to deal with personally other than paperwork and reports, a support and wizard-non-wizard liaison. Listening to the older wizards reminded her so much of the Audash. Don't think it. Cecilia made herself focus on the here and now, on the fireplace, on its brickwork, scorched and roasted over decades of use, before getting to her feet, folding her arms and walking towards the kitchen door. The north-facing room cooler than the living room and refreshing on her bare feet. The reciprocator movement would be different, of course, by its very role in a completely different society. The death of Aberforth would have changed it yet again. She opened the door to the kitchen, her bag swinging from her shoulder as she crossed the 1960s patterned tiles before opening the door and sitting on the fragile wooden steps that her parents-in-law had stood upon for their photo. That was why Cecilia had brought back the book, as a funeral gift to their tempestuous past, the reciprocators and her, parting at last and drawing a line. Would it be useful to them? She still didn't know what it contained, but Cecilia could work out that it mentioned the universal link, conjurists and non-wizards often enough to make it just a bit more than benign. Cecilia sighed at second only decision that she was wholeheartedly behind, the other being leaving the Durmstrang Institute in the first place, and she decided that she didn't care if anyone else agreed with her decision. The soft summer breeze played with her hideously patterned ankle-length skirt and she folded her arms. Of course, it wouldn't be for her to judge. If it was up to Cecilia she would have ignored it and come back empty-handed. But the conscience in her had been concerned that someone was seemingly attempting to discern between wizards and non-wizards using scientific evidence, and she knew well enough that the wizard to whom the work belonged had conjurist leanings and quite openly stated that both should be separate. Where Cleus was promoting policies based on entirely the opposite, if the work turned out to be what she suspected, an attempt at magical apartheid using science to justify it, her brother-in-law should be the one to read it and make decisions based upon it. In short, she had brought the book back for Cleus on the premise that, if she has been his spy, then here she was, with evidence of it all for him. She was done with it all. "You're so good, Chilius, at making people do what you want them to do," she said aloud to her absent brother-in-law. "If there was a prize for spin and double talk in politics, you'd definitely win hands down." And yet, thought Cecilia, though he was second to none at conniving, there was still one thing that had been so predictable, that Septimus would be there that summer, not at home with Remus in Edgeford. She had known that he and Remus had been living in the cottage in her absence, but whereas Remus had told her he would be moving back, to make a fresh start with her, it hadn't stopped their son from spending yet another summer with his uncle. Thoughts of their future together filled Cecilia's mind, and the muscles in her face smiled broadly, stinging and pulling into a rarely used expression. They would be happy once more, and Cleus would not be able to stop them. Of that Cecilia was determined with every fibre of her being. The image in her mind suddenly changed from the happy one she had been picturing in the mid-foreground into another. It took a few moments to realize that the figures standing there were actually real, though, and the flash that had preceded it was from an apparition. Helping her son to his feet, Severus Snape had taken his hand and appeared to be talking to him. Cecilia froze. Septimus. And he looked ill. He shouldn't be disapparating. Not at his age. No wonder he felt sick. Cecilia stumbled down the 5 stairs and onto the moss-covered ground. Neither had seen her, she ascertained, being over 100 yards away. Her heart beat faster, her baby boy, just there, grown up so much in the last 2 years, but unmistakably her little Tim. She swallowed the heavy lump in her throat as she trod ungainly over sharp shards of rock towards them. Then stopped. Septimus had seen her. A moment passed between them, and then time, as it was wont to do in these situations, stood still, and the distance between them grew smaller until they were both in each other's arms. A long look in their direction was the only pause that Severus Snape took before raising his wand and disapparating again, the sight of mother and son reunited in his view's wake.